Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook NCAA Tournament Edition. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, a man whose voice I know we've all missed over the last 4 or 5 weeks, the one, the only Payne Insider.
I think this is the first time we've actually communicated via speaking since the Super Bowl. Is this possible?
You know what they say, Payne? Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and I think by the time football season's over, you need a break from me as much as I need a break from you in terms of hearing each other's dulcet tones over the phone.
Who would need a break from me? You did go on vacation, and I felt really bad because I was like, I'm just going to leave this guy alone. But you were texting me more than I was texting you while you were on vacation.
Well, I mean, you got to stay in touch. You got to make sure you keep your fingers on the pulse of everything going on. But yep, took a few days, went to the Hawaiian Islands. May or may not have been detained in an airport on Monday because we didn't have a negative COVID test that was required. So that provided a little unique wrinkle. But it's not as though you've stayed quarantined in Miami. I'm sure you've been out there hobnobbing with all the big shots.
I will say this, the over-under on 1 minute for the word COVID being used, you just failed miserably there.
Well, I mean, I had the prop bet myself, so I was trying to tank it in my favor.
Gotcha. No, I'm just relaxing. That's it. Relaxing.
Just relaxing, the man says. Well, up until we get into the cram session that became the preparation for the NCAA Tournament Edition. For all of those that are new listeners to our Bet the Board 3-part series, we'll have a episode obviously here for the round of 64 that'll take us into the second weekend. We'll be back with you next week for the Sweet 16 and of course the final podcast that'll showcase the final four. But before games tip off with the first four later on Thursday, I encourage all of you, FanDuel.com/bettheboard. Take advantage of all the risk-free bets that are there. Spread the love campaign. We all could use an extra out this time of year. Great future prices and plenty of ways to get some skin in the game during the big dance. And Payne, a little bit uncharted territory, obviously, with the slight modifications in format. We'll have all four play-in games taking place on Thursday, a wraparound weekend of sorts, Friday and Saturday, of course, being the opening round, and then Sunday and Monday being the round of 32. And when it comes to filling out your bracket, since folks have an extra 24 hours, I think it's always important just to get a quick take on how you may approach it and how different it is, obviously, than when you're handicapping individual games, forecasting out 2.5, 3 weeks in advance.
First of all, do you like this new schedule?
I do not, because I'm a creature of habit. So anytime you throw a wrench into something we've grown accustomed to, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, the wraparound to Monday is interesting. And it's not like the games are starting like super early. I don't know. I like the old format better, but hey, at least we have March Madness. At least we're able to fill out some brackets. And I think we talk about this, but we'll have new listeners. When it comes to filling out your bracket, your entire plan should be based upon the size of your pool. And it's really as simple as that. Smaller the pool, the smaller the variance you want. If it's a pool with literally like your family and a couple buddies, less variance, you are going to be advancing the favorites most of the way. But if you're doing an office pool with like a couple hundred people or one online with tens of thousands, it's near impossible to go chalk and win. And your goal obviously is to come in the money, right? Like not finish 31st and be like, hey, showed pretty well here. So if you're in a larger pool, you're going to want more variance, especially if you get additional points for like upsets, you know? You want to take some of those calculated shots if you are able to get points based upon what the seed number is. So that's just how I would go about it. Specific to the tournament this year, I think we might be able to lean on things being a little bit wilder. You know, I mean, we saw this already to some extent, right, with professional athletes having issues in the bubble. We had, Milwaukee and the Clippers get bounced early. We had a Miami Heat team that's struggling to be in the playoffs this year, in the finals last year. And we just saw teams like Georgetown, who was like 9-12, win 4 games in 4 days. The last 3 against teams that were all top 50. So the larger the pool, especially in a year like this, you're going to want to have some variance to your bracket.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that, like you always say for survivor pools, do you want to be in an advance week to week, or do you want to set yourself up with a chance to win? And it's no knock, because there's a very good chance that Gonzaga at 2-1, Baylor at 6-1, Illinois at 6-1, or Michigan at 8-1 could go out there and cut down the nets. But if you're in a pool Payne like I am, based in Chicago, where almost everyone is a Big Ten alum and an Illinois fan, it makes things a little bit more difficult if you want to try and mirror the field, if you want to go out there and ultimately win things. So as Payne said, it's so important to understand the rules, the scoring system, and geography plays such a big role as well in terms of how you want to go filling that out. But never let that impact some of your day-to-day wagers. And clearly opinions, current form, and everything else can change by the time you get into the second weekend and ultimately the third weekend.
Absolutely. And I think it also varies like region to region, right? And we'll get into it a little bit deeper, but the East region might be the region where, you want to have a little bit more of that variance as opposed to the West region. Just my thoughts, but something to consider, right, when we're talking about variances, kind of looking at how this might play out. You see a Gonzaga team who probably has the easiest draw, and there's a couple teams in there dealing with COVID, and, Iowa's ceiling is probably not as high as other teams despite being really good. And you get to the East, and it's like, to me, a complete crapshoot. So, figuring out where you want to have a little bit more variance in your bracket, I think, is big as well.
Well, as we go down that path before we get into the individual regions, and for those folks that are expecting us to break down every single first-round game, we love all of you, but you're absolutely delusional, so that won't be happening by any stretch of the imagination. We'll talk about a lot of the top seeds. We'll find a matchup in each region and some other unique handicapping tidbits that you can use along the way. And I think one of the more compelling places to always start, Payne, and the committee, to their credit, has gotten better over the years as they use more of the advanced metrics and some tools that we don't have some of those glaring inconsistencies from odds standpoint to teams being overseeded or underseeded, but inevitably there's always a couple teams that'll fall into each bucket. When you look at teams, in your opinion, that were overseeded based on some of your numbers, who jumps out to you?
I think the biggest one is Wichita State. I don't even know how they're in the dance as an at-large. That was surprising.
A peace offering to Greg Marshall?
I mean, the AAC is down. They're the 9th best conference by our ratings, and you downgrade it substantially at head coach to kick off the season. As you mentioned, Greg Marshall. I mean, X's and O's wise, Greg Marshall's one of the best. So to lose him, that's pretty tough. And then you just look metrically, because I know you said that you think the committee uses those a little bit more now. I think they just created their own and called them quadrants. But hey, neither here nor there.
Using more now is better than none they used to use in previous years. So when you go from 0 to 1, it's a monumental leap forward.
Yeah, so, I mean, just when I look at Wichita State, they play like a snail, yet they don't really defend at an elite level. I mean, that is a tough combination, right? If you're not burning energy, like getting up the court and getting easy baskets, you better be able to defend, and they just haven't. So when I look at Wichita State, the last 10 seasons, they finished 26th or better in defensive efficiency 7 times. Last season under Greg Marshall, Wichita State was 8th in defensive efficiency. This season, again, in 2021, you are playing outside the top 200 in pace, but you are also outside the top 100 in defensive efficiency. I don't know how that's possible, but I mean that's the situation with Wichita State. They're undersized. They're outside the top 300 in both defensive rebounding and 2-point field goal defense. They don't make the free throws. They don't turn teams over. Todd, we have them power rated outside the top 100, so I don't know how they got an at-large bid.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, it does make you wonder when you look at some of the other teams that were passed over that were on the bubble. St. Louis didn't do themselves any favors in the Atlantic 10 Conference Tournament. You look at Louisville, the 69th team, I guess, the way the committee set it up. Colorado State, and I've watched them enough. I don't care if they're in the tournament. And then, of course, Ole Miss, who on their best day definitely looked like a tournament team. I would agree that I think Wichita State, somehow by hook or by crook was able to get themselves in, and that's part of the reason that you've seen nearly a 4-point move against Drake in the first 4 matchup.
Drake is very sharp. Let's just put it that way. That has been one of the larger positions by the groups that I've seen so far. How about you? Anything that stands out to you in terms of overseeded team?
For me, it always goes down to some of those teams on the power seed lines. And I guess a team that I'll openly admit I've struggled with all season long has been the Kansas Jayhawks. I know they played a lot better down the stretch. They got their season-defining win when they upset Baylor at Allen Fieldhouse late in the campaign. But I was a little bit surprised to see them on the 3 seed line. I know the Big 12 probably power rates the second best league behind the Big 10, but at the same time, I thought Kansas was kind of a step down, but it looks like the entire league was given the benefit of the doubt. West Virginia, a couple of close losses down the stretch, but I thought Kansas was a step down, so to see them as a 3 seed, not surprising given the pedigree, but their overall body of work for me didn't quite warrant it.
We'll get to Kansas moving forward, but I completely agree. They were more of like a 5 or 6 seed for us.
So it's just one of those things that's always difficult to try and figure out with some of the boys hailing from the bigger leagues. And I think the SEC, to be quite honest, is a league that I've struggled with. So I'm curious to get your take when we get into a couple of the higher profile teams there and expectations for deep runs, whether it be with Alabama or Arkansas. But with overseeded teams paying, there are obviously sides that are underseeded. So in terms of power numbers, who is underseeded in your opinion?
I think Loyola Chicago's the obvious one, right? The committee did a horrific job seeding the Ramblers, and depending on our filters, Loyola Chicago somewhere between the 7th and 13th best team in the entire country, and somehow the committee has them an 8 seed, forced to potentially play Big Brother in the second round. But I feel like that's a little bit, obvious. If I'm just looking at pure seeding, nothing else, not the matchup in round 1 or an ability to make noise in the tournament and be Cinderella, just simply where we rank them versus where the committee seeded them, it's probably Colgate. Colgate to me is a top 30 team. They are more like a 5 or 6 seed, not a 14. You have the 3 key cogs in Burns, Richardson, and Ferguson. They've played on this stage, right? They took number 2 Tennessee to the brink in the 2019 tournament. And I think you take this with a grain of salt because it was just a 15-game season for Colgate, and they didn't play games out of conference. But, in an analytically driven game, Colgate's the only team in this tournament that ranks top 3 in both offensive and defensive 3-point efficiency. And I think there's some other guys out there that, provide some numbers, delve into the analytics, and Colgate's 9th in net. So again, like strictly looking at the number the committee placed in front of their name, Colgate is wildly underseeded. Now, really tough matchup in round 1 against Arkansas. Right, that's a team that's like long, athletic, defends the 3-ball well. I'm not sure Colgate's style of like trying to get up and down the court and launch threes will work overly well against a bigger, stronger, faster, more athletic Razorbacks team that also wants to get up and down. Right, like Arkansas's top 10 in adjusted tempo. I'm not sure you want to play a game against Arkansas and be like, hey, let's race them to 85 and see who wins. Right, but again, strictly on the number in front of the school name, Colgate is really underseeded.
Yeah, not going to lie. I would have loved to see Colgate actually slip down to the 15 seed line and draw a team like Iowa. I think that would have created a very compelling matchup. Not necessarily because of the size they would have had to contend with Luka Garza, but it'd be one of the rare higher profile opponents where Colgate might actually be slightly more athletic.
Garza may have put up 30 and 30 there.
Oh, well, Garza puts up 30 and 30 against everybody. He may put up 30 and 30 against Grand Canyon and still not be enough to cover as a 15-point favorite. For me, Payne, the one league, and we talk about it all the time, I know West Coast basketball is soft. I felt like the Pac-12 didn't get any credit. I actually think this trio of Pac-12 teams that are in the tournament, I'm not counting UCLA because they tailed off towards the end of the season. So the 3 teams in that 5, 6, 7 line of Colorado, USC, and Oregon, I felt all 3 of those teams were discounted a bit. Now, I may be eating crow because you send me a text Saturday by noon when all 3 are eliminated from the tournament. But at the same time, I felt like the level of play in this league was better than we've seen in years past. And at least one of those teams is capable of getting into the second weekend and maybe wreaking a little bit of havoc.
I don't disagree. I think we've already seen that Colorado's a little bit undervalued in the market. They're now out to a 6-point favorite as of this morning. You are never going to have to twist my arm on a Dana team. I think Oregon has the potential to make some noise. It's an interesting matchup there, potentially against Iowa. And USC, you may hear about them a little bit later in the show because we're doing a segment where we are taking a team outside the top 5 in each region and maybe showing a potential to make a little noise. And USC might be there for me. I think they probably have the best player on the court pretty much any night they step on it. So I'm kind of in lockstep with you there on the Pac-12.
Might be the nicest thing you've said about that entire league in 6 years of doing a college football or college basketball podcast. So we're going to take the win and we're going to close up shop. 15 minutes in and out, podcast over, right? That's how we do things?
I think people on the left coast would appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what we have. All right, let's get into these regions, and we'll start for those folks that have their brackets out in front of them, going from, left to right, up, down. Either way, we're starting in the West with an overwhelming favorite to get to the Final Four, and that, of course, being the tournament's number 1 overall seed in Gonzaga, who's listed as a $2.60 favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. They're followed by Iowa at 4-1 to win the region, Kansas at 10-1, Creighton 12, Virginia 12, Oregon 20, SC 20, and so on down the board. So when we look at Gonzaga, Payne, 26-0 so far this season, we know about some of their scoring options that they have, guys that can flat out fill it up, and Corey Kispert, Drew Timme, and Jalen Suggs. Non-conference-wise, the biggest wins came, oddly enough, against 3 teams that they could encounter in this bracket in one way, shape, or form. Kansas, West Virginia, Iowa, and Virginia. West Virginia, the only team to play Gonzaga to single digits this year. But the biggest question mark I have watching Gonzaga, and I watched a little bit of the West Coast Conference Tournament to get an indication as well, they don't feel to be as physical on the interior, and you wonder about that lack of physical presence will ultimately be their undoing, or can they be the first team since the 1976 Indiana Hoosiers to run the table, go undefeated, finish 32-0, and cut down the nets?
Listen, I think everyone's looking for a reason to fade Gonzaga. Be contrarian, right? Like fade the undefeated number 1 overall seed that won't play a game on the West Coast, and then, as you mentioned, they have a little bit of that added pressure of running the table. And they haven't played the best competition this season, outside the top 100 in strength of schedule and what we have as the 8th best conference. So they're not really battle-tested. And Gonzaga didn't perform overly well away from home either when you look at expectations metrically. So I think those are pretty much the reasons you'll hear about fading Gonzaga. And I will tell you mentioned their region price of minus 260. Smoked. It opened minus 200. So I think that says a lot. And I'm not saying like the Zags won't slip up and stub their toe somewhere along the line here. But this is a really favorable region and draw. Like Gonzaga's already played and beaten Iowa, who has athletic deficiencies, by double digits on a neutral. They've beaten 3-seed Kansas by double digits on a neutral and 4-seed Virginia by more than 3 touchdowns. Kansas and Virginia are dealing with COVID issues. I mentioned at the top, right? Kansas feels more like a 4 or 5 seed based on the metrics. Virginia struggled down the stretch. They're outside the top 300 in momentum. It just feels like the best team got a really nice draw here, Todd.
Yeah, and we talk about every year Gonzaga seems to get shafted. This season they've been given a favorable path to try and at least get to the Final Four and have a chance to win their first national championship in program history. So we'll talk more about the Zags, I'd imagine, as we get into the round of 16. I'd be stunned, Payne, if they lost as a number 1 seed in that 16 matchup and even in the 8-9 game against the winner of Oklahoma, Missouri, when you talk about teams that are dealing with some COVID stuff. You mentioned the Iowa Hawkeyes and the lack of athleticism for this team, but they do have Luka Garza, National Player of the Year, Joe Wieskamp, more than capable of bombing from deep, paired with Jordan Bohannon. They had a little bit of lack of depth. Well, they do have a depth concern, in my opinion, when you lose Jack Noonge, who averaged about 16 minutes per game. And a PSA in advance, we're going to butcher a lot of these names, or at least I will. So for you guys that want to fill up my mentions, knock yourself out when it comes down to it. But when I look at this Iowa team, Payne, for as well as they play down the stretch, they do have a couple bad losses during the season. When you get swept by the Hoosiers, not a ringing endorsement, but to Fran McCaffrey's credit, the team started to defend with a little bit more tenacity over the last 5-6 games of the regular season.
No doubt about it, but their calling card is offense, and they just shoot the piss out of it. And number 2 in offensive efficiency, 120 points per 100 possessions. They knock down threes. They can shoot the mid-range, and, you have Luka Garza to deal with in the post. But I mentioned this, right? Sometimes Iowa can be out-athleted by elite teams. They're 1-5 against our top 10 this season. They're just inside the top 50 in defensive efficiency. They're not the best perimeter defenders because of, the athleticism deficiency. And they're outside the top 225 in defending the three ball. They are outside the top 300 in creating turnovers. So it does make me a little bit nervous, right? And you're talking about a team that does have Luka Garza download. They're outside the top 200 in defensive rebound. So you add it all up, and it's just like this inability to turn teams over and rebound the ball defensively. It makes me a little bit nervous. Iowa's the 8th worst team in the country in opponent shot attempt rate, so they're allowing their opponents to get up a ton of looks. And, you just can't give good teams that many shot attempts. Now, don't get me wrong. I think Iowa's really good. And you mentioned this perfectly. The intensity and effort defensively has been there of late. This was an Iowa team that was outside the top 100 in defensive efficiency at one point this season, and they've gotten it down to 50th. But it just feels like their ceiling is a little bit lower compared to the other elite teams in this tournament.
Can't argue that. Now, I'm going to be fascinated, honestly, to see how Iowa handles the Twin Towers that Grand Canyon will throw at them in that 215 matchup. Obviously, Bryce Drew's team not going to be nearly as athletic or have the same perimeter capabilities that the Hawkeyes possess. But in a game where you could see limited possessions, we'll see if they can frustrate Luka Garza, use the 10-plus fouls to try and hack the big man inside and maybe keep that game a little bit closer if the tempo should play in the Antelopes' favor. When we look at the Kansas Jayhawks, Payne, they closed the season 8-1. Their lone loss was an overtime defeat against Texas. Of course, a no contest for them in the Big 12 Conference Tournament because of COVID issues. Best win in that mix, aforementioned, against Baylor at Lawrence, a game they dominated as a 4.5, 5-point underdog. Finished the year top 10 in defensive efficiency. They forced opponents to work for everything at that end of the court, but unlike previous Kansas editions, this team, at least to me, seems extremely limited in some of their offensive capabilities.
No question. And we know they're dealing with a couple COVID issues. David McCormick, the most notable of the players, has been impacted. Bill Self admitted they're not going to Indianapolis with a full group. So I have no idea what Kansas is. They did come on down the stretch, playing with some good momentum. It feels like, to me, that Bill Self doesn't get a ton of credit from a lot of the analytics guys as being a great coach, but he always seems to have his team playing pretty well down the stretch, and those guys have started to buy in. Now, the offense, as you alluded to, is the Achilles heel. They're ranked 59th in offensive efficiency. And if you look at Kansas, the efficiency data goes all the way back to 2002. This is the worst Kansas offense over that stretch, okay? This team makes its hay on defense. They allow 87 points per 100 possessions. They're good defending shots from all three areas, deep, mid-range, and at the hoop. They do a good job defending without fouling. So, they're not sending teams to the free throw line all that much and giving them freebies. I kind of mentioned this already, right? Kansas is more of like a 5 seed than a 3. If somehow they can get healthy, you get hot from the floor and hit a few shots, and their defense remains top 5 efficiency, maybe Kansas can make a run. But they just struggle too much offensively for my liking.
When you look at the top teams in the West, Payne, who, in your opinion, provides the biggest matchup threat to Gonzaga before we get into teams seeded 5 or lower that we think could be a little bit of a dark horse / Cinderella?
I don't really think there is one. And that's why I kind of alluded to the fact that, everyone is out here trying to slay the giant, and they have all this added pressure on their shoulders. But as you mentioned, you saw the West region. That is real professional money laying the $2, and that's why it's out to $260. Maybe you get to Iowa if Iowa can make it that far. But that'll be a really interesting matchup if somehow USC and their big man against Luka Garza, that's an interesting matchup. But maybe it's Iowa. I don't know. I just don't know if that's the right matchup to beat Gonzaga. But to me, Gonzaga has a walk to the Final Four here. I really believe that. And we're not getting off the Gonzaga train now. I mean, what was the one future I sent you before the season?
It was Gonzaga, and they were running over men, women, and children to bet the Bulldogs at prices of 10-1 or better. Yeah,
it started at 13 and went to 11 and still taking 10-1. So this is a team that we've liked from the onset, and I just think this is probably the best iteration of Gonzaga, and they have a really favorable draw.
Well, that's been my contention, that if Gonzaga can't win a national championship this year with a current compilation of talent, it may never happen for Mark Few to bring that title back to Spokane. But as far as the top seeds, when we hit on all of them, we'll get to the 4 in a little bit for their fascinating matchup against Ohio for some things not basketball related. But when you look for other teams, you mentioned USC, Payne. This will be their first NCAA tournament appearance since 2017, the third tournament appearance under head coach Andy Enfield, who took over back in 2013. They have an NBA caliber talent that's going to go in the top 5, arguably in Evan Mobley. Can USC be the team to make that deep Cinderella-like run?
Yeah, I think this is the one team that makes sense because Todd and I kind of just put together what do we want to do for these regions to make them a little bit more interesting. We'll talk about the top teams. We'll talk about a team outside the top 5 that can make some noise, and then we'll break down one of the more intriguing matchups within that region for the first round. But to me, it's USC. I've dangled this, right? And I initially debated and tried getting cute with Ohio. They got a great point guard. They gave Illinois a run earlier in the season. So I think everyone's kind of gravitating towards Ohio, but they can't spell defense. UCSB seems to be another trendy dog, but they could have a starter out against Creighton. Ultimately, I think USC because, their size is going to be far too much for Drake. And I've mentioned numerous times, I think Kansas is overseeded. They're dealing with COVID. No reason USC can't sneak into the Sweet 16 here. You mentioned Evan Mobley. He's going to be the best player on the floor pretty much any time USC is playing a game. We know Andy Enfield's tournament pedigree. I mean, you can't debate that. You have Taj Edey. He's an efficient guard that gives USC a nice little inside-out game. And when you look at the Trojans, they average 110 points per 100 possessions, even though they're not the most efficient offense. They make a ton of their near proximity shots, almost 65% of them. They're good enough from 3. They're fantastic from mid-range. But the key to them is making their free throws. USC does a fantastic job getting to the line. They're just 326th in the country in free throw percentage. If you can somehow shoot in the low to mid 70s from the free throw line, there's no reason USC can't make a Sweet 16 run knowing the defense is their calling card.
Going to be interesting to watch this Trojans team. They struggled when they had to step up in class a little bit. Colorado kind of had their number in league play. But other than that, SC kind of exceeded expectations. And because a lot of people don't watch a ton of West Coast basketball, they've flown under the radar. I think they'll have a favorable matchup regardless of who emerges from the play-in game between Drake and Wichita State to help the Trojans get into the round of 32, setting up what could be one of the more intriguing games against the Kansas Jayhawks if seeds hold. We didn't talk about the 4 seed early on. You mentioned Ohio and some of their lack of defense. This has been one of the bigger movers, Payne, of the opening round. We saw Virginia open as much as a 10.5-point favorite. Of course, COVID issues have precluded them from traveling on a normal schedule. We're not quite sure who may or may not be available for Virginia. This number has come all the way down to 7 before it took a little bit of money on the favorite. When you look at this Virginia team, not as good from a pack line defense standpoint as what we've seen in the past. They lack that big interior presence in the mold of a Mamadou Diakite, but they can score the ball a little bit better, led by Sam Hauser. However, Ohio on the other side, we can make the case, and I don't think it's a reach by any stretch of the imagination, they're going to have the most dynamic playmaker in the form of talented guard Jason Preston.
You mentioned the 4-point move. And, aside from Virginia's entire team being in contact tracing, we're still trying to figure out which player or players might not make the round 1 trip at all. I mean, Virginia's not even practicing. Their players come off quarantine today. They don't travel to Indiana until Friday. So there's been virtually no live ball work for Virginia for like 9 full days. That's a factor. And we have seen Ohio play to this level before. I mentioned this earlier. They went into Illinois late November and took Illinois to the brink. Lost by 2. Virginia's played Ohio's conference foe Kent State at home and needed overtime to win, despite Kent State only attempting 6 free throws and shooting 9 for 32 from 3. So this isn't a spot where like Ohio is going to be overwhelmed. And when you play at the pace Virginia does with the style they employ, your opponents are rarely ever out of it. So that's why we saw the number grab at 10.5, 11, because the true line probably is somewhere where it sits now, and you have all the COVID questions. Now, if Ohio wants to stay within this number, their offense has to be as good as advertised, especially in the half court. Ohio's a top 30 offense that shoots the 3 ball pretty well. They have 6 players nationally ranked in offensive rating. The team averaged 108 points per 100 possessions. So I think they're more than capable scoring, right? Especially inside. They do a pretty good job there, 63% on short distance shots. But they're not going to get anything cheap on Virginia in transition. There's not going to have, not going to be many second chance opportunities. Ohio has to run good half-court offense here. But I think if they actually want to pull off the upset, which seems to be what a lot of people are calling for, they need to be better on the other side of the floor. They need to be better defensively. I mean, it's pretty ugly. And maybe that comes with some rust from Virginia's offense or a key cog or two being out. But Ohio has to be better defensively. They've struggled to defend the three ball. They're outside the top 160 there. They also have issues defending the paint. Ohio's, I'm looking right now, they struggle to provide resistance at the rim. They only block 5% of rim shots. Average opponents are converting 64% of their near proximity shots. You're looking at Virginia, I mean, that's kind of where they clean up, right? 65% near proximity shot rate. Jay Huff, got to watch the Syracuse game on my flight, and Jay Huff seems like he is just coming of age. He's been pretty dominant down low, so he could have a field day. And so I think, Virginia has a real advantage on this end of the court. Let's see if they're a little rusty. I don't know. But I mean, they are slow, and they keep teams in the game. They're the slowest D1 team in the country, Virginia is. And so if the efficiency and crispness isn't quite there, then maybe you could see Ohio hang around here. So very interesting game. For me, this is more like 6.8 to 7.1 range in terms of the number. So again, it made total sense getting out and taking the 11, the 10.5, the 10. And honestly, we did see this tick back up. There was a couple 8s that popped late last night. By the time I woke up, 8 was gone again. So it'll be interesting to see ultimately what unfolds with who's potentially out for Virginia and doesn't make the trip.
And again, this is what we always talk about. It may be a different sport, but the rules of thumb stay the same. If you're taking 11, the handicap is significantly different than if you're taking 7 at the bottom of the market, especially with falls and late game situations and everything else that's there. If you happen to miss the number, guys, do not run to the window to chase some of the steam that may be there. You can take advantage of the live numbers. And who knows, you may watch the first 4 minutes. Virginia could come out white hot, and you could see conditioning play a role or something else along those lines. So if you happen to miss the number early on, there's a side you like. Be patient. FanDuel offers plenty of great opportunities from a live betting standpoint. From the West, Payne, let's head east, where Michigan is the number 1 overall seed in that region. And when you look at the current prices at FanDuel Sportsbook, the Wolverines plus 190 to win the region. They're followed by Alabama at 4-1, Texas 5.5 to 1. Your beloved Florida State Seminoles at 7-1, the UConn Huskies 12-1, Colorado 17-1, along with LSU, and everybody else at prices of 20-1 or greater. When you look at the 4 number 1 overall seeds, I don't think it's a reach by any stretch of the imagination to say that Michigan might be the most vulnerable, not just because of the injury to Isaiah Livers, who 31 plus minutes per game, was first on the team. His points per game second at 13, and his rebounds per game 6 placed him third. But because one of the opponents that they may face could be at LSU in the second round, they could have their hands full. But when you look at the Michigan Wolverines, I have to give Juwan Howard a ton of credit. I did not expect it this season. They were 125 to win the national championship. And regardless of how they play during the month of March, this has to be considered a successful campaign in Ann Arbor.
Without question. And I think the CEO approach, let Juwan handle recruiting. He brought on some really good bench coaches to handle the X's and O's stuff. And I think that's potentially what we undervalued, is who he brought on his staff to handle the day-to-day workings of the scheme, because we weren't quite sure Juwan could do that. And sure enough, he was cognizant that that was probably his weakness, that he needed to hire some great schematic coaches and just let him be the CEO, go out there and recruit and be the face, and this is where Michigan is. Now, I know it might be overkill for some of our listeners hearing about Isaiah Livers, but you mentioned it because it is important, and the metrics and the record aren't great without him on the floor. If you look at the last 2 seasons when Livers plays, Michigan's offense flirts with being one of the 10 most efficient offenses. Without Livers, you're looking at an offense outside the top 25 in points per 100 possessions. Record-wise, the last 2 seasons, Michigan's 33-9 with Livers, just 6-7 without him. Now, I will say this, for Michigan fans, don't jump off a cliff. It would feel like they're better adapting to life without Livers this season than they would have been last season, but still a blow. You're still losing a player, as you alluded to, that plays the most minutes. He's got an efficiency rank of 21, so he's significantly better than an average player. The slight difference, though, this season versus last, was that Livers was the only Michigan player on the court for over 50% of the minutes and had an offensive rating above 110. This season, Michigan has 5 other players that fit the criteria of playing 50% or more minutes with an offensive rating of 110 or better. So this isn't quite the death blow it was a season ago for Michigan, but this still feels like a team that has a chance to make the Sweet 16. But you do wonder like what their ceiling is without Livers because, despite being top 10 in both offensive and defensive efficiency, there's some times where Michigan isn't overly consistent and they've struggled on the road compared to expectation. And you mentioned if LSU can maybe somehow figure out how to beat St. Bonaventure and they start to take better shots and focus a little bit more on the defensive end.
Those are big ifs, and those are massive leaps of faith.
But they're so talented that if they improve their shot selection, LSU, and if they decide to defend a little bit better, which they have when they switch to man, they have the talent to certainly make a Final Four run, but we'll see. I don't know if this is, again, the death blow that it would have been a year ago for Michigan without Isaiah Livers.
Well, it's a credit to what the Wolverines have done to upgrade their overall offensive talent. Hunter Dickinson has been a solid interior presence. You've seen Franz Wagner contribute quite nicely from the outside, and we'll see if the Wolverines can, as you said, exceed expectations if Livers is on the shelf for a little bit longer than we all anticipate. The number 2 seed in the region, LSU's arch rival, at least on the football field, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Winners of 6 straight, 9 of 10 down the stretch, outlasted LSU in the SEC Conference Championship game. The team has struggled all season, Payne, controlling the defensive glass. Biggest weakness, in my opinion, for them is that they lack a true rim protector when you go relatively small ball. But to Nate Oates' team's credit, they've been more than proficient from beyond the arc. They've attempted more threes than any team in the tournament. They've made more threes than any team in the tournament. The 2 seed will match the highest in school history that they also achieved in 1987 and back in 2002. Payne, the most interesting part about this, the first SEC tournament title for Alabama last weekend came since 1991 when they were led by Robert Ory and Latrell Sprewell. What can the Alabama Crimson Tide do on the hardwoods this March?
Our beloved Sprewell.
Spree, baby. I think I got his jersey hanging in my closet. I may have to try and dust it off for this.
Man, that was a fun Knicks team. All right. Listen, when I look at Alabama, you mentioned some great things about them. It's clear Nate Oates has immediately transformed Alabama. And the one thing that you also have to like is they're battle tested this year. We have them facing the 12th toughest schedule in college basketball. They're dominant on the defensive end, number 2 in efficiency on that side of the court overall. They allow 86 points per 100 possessions. Their guards are quick, they're long, they're athletic. They close out in the three-point line, top 10 in the country in defending the deep ball. They block 11% of rim shots. Now, their offense is a bit ragtag, right? They want to run, and run some more. Top 10 in adjusted pace. Almost 41% of Alabama shots come in transition. They want to turn you over. They're 6th in points off steals. They like to crash the offensive glass and score off second chance opportunities. So the way to beat Alabama is not turning it over, forcing them to score in the half court. It's possible a team like UConn that's 301st in the country in adjusted tempo, who wants to play in the half court, might be a team that could annoy Alabama if they're able to survive Maryland in the first round. So that's something to look for. But, you have to like what Nate Oates is doing. Alabama is super athletic. But if you can get them in the half court, force them to shoot jump shots, you have a chance. If not, they're going to run you out of the building.
This is an Alabama team that we've seen on their absolute best make it rain against LSU during the regular season. I feel that game was 30-3 or something ridiculous the first 5 minutes of the game when everything was falling. But we've also seen them in games against teams like Oklahoma where you go on the road, can't make a shot, and you don't have that secondary pitch if your fastball isn't working. The Texas Longhorns, 3rd seed in this region, Payne, extremely versatile and athletic. They go with a 3-guard lineup with Jones, Coleman, and Ramey. And they have a couple of talented bigs, albeit inexperienced, in Greg Brown and Jericho Sims. Shaka Smart, he may be the one beneficiary in all of college basketball to benefit from the pandemic, because there's a very good chance that he would have lost his job last season if Texas didn't make the tournament. Instead, he kept the core together, and we saw them cut down the nets for their first conference tournament championship in quite some time. But when you look at Shaka, the last 4 round of 64 games, well, it hasn't been kind to him. He watched his Texas Longhorns team blow a massive lead against Nevada in the opening round, a game that I hate to admit I was on the Texas Longhorns. 2016, we saw Texas lose on a half-court shot against Northern Iowa. And even his last 2 campaigns with VCU in 2014, 2015, he came up on the wrong end of things. They'll take on Abilene Christian early on, but when you look at Texas, a lot of people have talked about them as their dark horse in this particular region. I'm not so sure I'm willing to buy into that narrative necessarily.
Todd, we know boosters are flush, but they still have a budget in mind, right? They had to buy out a football coach. So
had to buy out multiple football coaches.
So that's why Shaka Smart survived along with some of the COVID issues. And we knew he was on the hot seat coming into the season. And effectively what Shaka Smart did was like throw his system out the window and just let his guys play. He decided to hey, it might be a good idea to let my long, bouncy athletes get up and down the floor. And that's kind of what's been the difference for Texas. Last season, the Longhorns were 292nd in adjusted pace. Only 24% of their shots came in transition. This season, Texas 139th in adjusted pace. Almost 32% of their shots come in transition. What do you know? Most efficient Texas offense in the Shaka Smart era. So, if he can get them to limit the dumb long twos in the mid-range jumpers, they could take that next step. What I do like is Texas can do damage from deep and around the rim on offense, which is nice. They make 65% of their near proximity shots with some of the big fellas you mentioned. You'd like Texas to do some of the little things better. And if they can, maybe it is a team that can make some runs, right? They have a propensity to turn it over. They're not great at the free throw line. Those are the kind of things that get you beat in close games. But if the Longhorns can kind of clean up the mental areas, there's no reason they can't fight for an Elite 8 bid.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Texas, regardless of who they were to play, should they survive Abilene Christian in that opening round, the winner of BYU against UCLA, Michigan State, I don't think any of that trio of teams would provide a massive threat to Texas. To be quite honest, it's a team I was hoping had some disastrous matchups and landmines in front of them because I was looking to bet against. I'm not quite sure the bracket's going to allow for that early on. When we look at the rest of this particular region, and we'll get to the LSU St. Bonaventure game in a minute, we try and find a team outside of the top 5 that has the makings of that bracket disruptor, so to speak. You mentioned one in the form of the UConn Huskies that I had circled. I wasn't sure if that was a team you wanted to highlight or if there was a different direction you wanted to go in.
I mean, I kind of mentioned at the top, right? Like you're looking for regions to maybe have some variance. This would be the one. I mean, you could make a case for Michigan, LSU, FSU, Texas, UConn, Alabama, and maybe even BYU, like to potentially all make or have a shot at making the Final Four. Like that, this is going to be the region, I think, the East, that has a ton of variance. But from a value perspective, UConn's really the one that makes the most sense as the team outside the top 5 seeds to potentially make some noise. UConn for us is more like a 4 or 5 seed by the numbers. When you look at the matchup, if they can get past Maryland, and that's not going to be an easy task, they're the type of team that might annoy Alabama and get them to play a game that's not their style, right? Like Connecticut plays like a snail outside the top 300 in adjusted pace. So if you have a slowed down game and force Alabama to hit jumpers, you have a chance. UConn does a really good job defending the paint, second best in the country in defending near proximity shots. UConn blocks over 18% of shots at the rim. So again, get Alabama in the half court, force them to shoot long jumpers because you have some good interior defense. Overall, UConn's pretty balanced. Top 25 in both offensive and defensive efficiency. So, both you and I, Todd, think the world of Dan Hurley. So if I'm kind of forced here, I'd go UConn as a team outside the top 5 to potentially disrupt some things in that East region.
And big news for UConn as well. RJ Cole appears to have cleared concussion protocol, so there aren't some concerns about his availability. James Bouknight hopefully should be at full go 100%. Definitely, in my opinion, the most dynamic player overall in the Big East, and I think the one that'll add the most value, and it takes a little bit of pressure off a guy like Tyrese Martin as well. So I'm right there with you with the Huskies. And what's crazy about them, Payne, is you look around the landscape. I've seen them as low as 7-1 to win the region. I've seen them as high as 14-1. So like we tell all of you, our loyal listeners, do your due diligence and make sure you're shopping around for the best available price, especially if you'd like to take a flyer somewhere in the mix. Opening round matchup, though, LSU and St. Bonaventure, the 8-9 showdown. You're looking at LSU, a 1.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. The total hovering anywhere from 142.5 in the low end. I've seen it as high as 144. You mentioned early on in the show, Payne, talking about LSU. This team is dynamic offensively. Cameron Thomas, Trendon Wofford, and Javonte Smart. 1, 2, 3, maybe as good as any trio in the country. The problem being for LSU is sometimes they get a little bit lax, and lax might not be a strong enough word for how they want to perform on the defense. They're in the bottom third in the SEC in points per game allowed. They do a terrible job of defensive rebounding. We saw that in the last tournament 2 years ago, rear its ugly head against Michigan State, who just beat them to a pulp when it came to the rebounding side of things. Meanwhile, St. Bonaventure on the other side, Mark Schmidt has led an impressive team that finished 16-4 this season. Team only played 3 games before the calendar flipped, so they handled a little bit of adversity with a slow start to the season. But guys like Kyle Lofton and Jaron Holmes, more than capable and comfortable playing in the half court, and that could be a style conducive to frustrating LSU.
Just pure power rating wise, we made this game pick. And if you told me the refs would swallow the whistle, you'd absolutely be looking at the Bonnies +2 because there'd be no other way to look. I think if you just rolled out the starting fives and jumped the ball, St. Bonaventure probably has a better than 50% chance to win this game. Unfortunately, they've got zero depth. Like 5 guys play 82 to 95% of the minutes. Candidly, like there is not a 6-man capable of being competent. Like Alejandro Vasquez plays that 6-man role for the Bonnies. He's played about 34% of the team's minutes. He has a player efficiency ranking of 10. So well below average. That's what would
That was
make...
like me on my rec league team back in the day. They just said, hey, Furman, you stand outside the perimeter, don't shoot.
Do you remember what color t-shirt you were?
I'm trying to think. The
Like
last
light,
team
I feel like you were like a light blue.
No, I feel like we went like mint green or something ridiculous.
Okay.
We may or may not have lost by 72 points in one game. We had nobody on our lineup more than 6 feet, so it was a little bit of a problem.
And thankfully for your parents, this is what led you to pick up a stick and get a scholarship.
Oh, my basketball skills never even got started. I think the last time I played organized basketball before I got suckered into playing pickup after moving out here to Vegas and joining the league, I think I finished at like 8 or 9. Payne, I don't think I've ever scored double digits in a game, and it doesn't matter what level, even playing against like my 5- and 6-year-old nieces and nephews and that sort of thing.
Knowing your personality, I feel like you were cable guy. Like you had the headband, the wristbands, and you're like diving all over the floor.
I was definitely the glue guy. I was definitely the glue guy, slapping the floor, trying to throw elbows if I needed to on the perimeter. But, when you're only about 150 pounds soaking wet, doesn't allow you to be that physically imposing on the defensive end of the court.
Yes. Back to the topic at hand before we run 3 hours on this podcast. The one thing Bonaventure does is they play really good defense. 16th in overall defensive efficiency. They close out on the 3-point line pretty well. They defend the mid-range game well. They're 4th in near proximity defense. They're blocking almost 13% of rim shots. They only allow 23% of their opponent's shots to come in transition, which is something LSU wants to do. Once the Bonnies can kind of force LSU to play in the half court, there's like an understanding, I think, that guys like you mentioned, Cam Thomas, Watford, and Smart, they don't necessarily have the best shot selection. So if you can force that trio who likes to play iso ball and take tough jumpers, you have a shot. Then it's all about rebounding the miss. That's somewhat of the area of concern here because the Bonnies are outside the top 200 in defensive rebounding. So you need to get LSU in the half court, make them take their weird jumpers, and rebound the basketball. But I think the way you win this game is slowing it down. Right? The Bonnies are 319th in adjusted pace. You got to execute in the half court. We know LSU struggles defensively, but I did mention they've been substantially better once Will Wade switched to a man defense, and there's plenty of talent there. So they could be better than their numbers with further buy-in, right, and effort, because this is the tournament. You just have to keep LSU honest here. Don't let them get cheap points in transition, rebound the ball. Don't let them crush you on the defensive glass. Pray you can stay out of foul trouble, and you might be able to like mentally outlast LSU. The reason I haven't bet this yet is because LSU's ceiling is substantially higher. Most of their deficiencies are mental. I mean, I mentioned this before, but like if they can figure out the shot selection and the defensive effort ticks up, which this is a tournament, right? One and done, you would think this is the most effort we'll see from LSU. They have the talent to make a Final Four run. So that's the ceiling here is something that makes me a little bit nervous. It's far higher than St. Bonaventure's ceiling.
Before we get out of this region, I have to ask your thoughts on Florida State because it might be the last time we mention this program in any capacity on the podcast, either football or college basketball, for quite some time. Seeded fourth, we saw them turn the ball over 25 times in the ACC title game. But this is a Knowles team that goes extremely deep, one of the tournament's best perimeter shooting teams.
Yeah.
Is Florida State a legitimate threat to make the Final Four?
They are. That's it. They are. And if you don't turn it over, there's a real chance that they may give Zaga a run. I believe they've faced each other in the last two tournaments.
They have created problems.
They have created problems. Team. So if they don't turn it over, they are tough to beat. Right? They got bigs. They got guys that can shoot it. They can get up and down the court. They can play in the half court. And they are a very, very good team. Now, we know this with Leonard Hamilton, and I hate to say this, but I've mentioned it before. Kudos to him, right? This is supposed to be a football program, and he's turned it into a basketball school right now. So his recruiting's been fantastic, but he is not some schematic wizard. So if you get a game where you are outcoached and they turn it over, this is typically how FSU soils themselves. But you kind of look at the coaching in the top part of that region. It doesn't necessarily scare you. But again, if FSU doesn't turn it over and they aren't completely outcoached, like this is a team that can certainly make the Final Four.
And a credit to FSU, this team goes extremely deep. They get 31.5 points per game from their reserves. That's best amongst all major conference schools and 7th nationally. So it's not as though they're a one-trick pony, although they're led by obviously Scotty Barnes, MJ Walker, and Raekwon Gray. So a team to watch for sure if you want to upset the apple cart. As we head into the South region, Payne, Baylor, the number one overall seed there. They are, of course, the favorite at FanDuel to come out at plus $1.10. You're looking at Ohio State, a shade less than 4-1. Texas Tech at 6-1, Arkansas 9-1, UNC 10-1, Purdue, same price, Nova 13, Wisconsin 13, and then everybody else 22 or higher. When we look at the Baylor Bears, this team is as good in the backcourt as any team in the country, but they haven't been able to regain some of that momentum and swagger they had before their COVID pause. When you look at Butler, you talked about a coach that's not a wizard from an X's and O's standpoint. Will he be able to roll the ball out there and let his athletes go out there and perform for Baylor to finally make the Final Four?
As you know, in the game of life, sometimes a big wallet helps negate some talent deficiencies with your so that's where Baylor stands with their head coach. Listen, I think we all know what Baylor can be. The talent is obviously through the roof. Maybe with a week off they can regroup and flip the switch, but really what's happened since the 21-day layoff in February isn't a team that would be one seed material. And if you look at Baylor, they're outside the top 340 in momentum coming into this tournament. 5-2 straight up their last 7. Over that stretch, they've been 8.5 points worse than market expectation on average. But, they're loaded, and they shoot the piss out of it. The offense is ridiculous. 121 points per 100 possessions. Number 3 in overall offensive efficiency. Number 1 in three-point shooting efficiency. They score the ball inside pretty well. They make 65% of their near proximity shots. And when they do actually miss, they crash the glass. 4th in offensive rebound rate. And when you give them a second chance, they make you pay. 14th in second chance scoring opportunities. Defensively is where the question mark is. And it's why I think Baylor's interesting, because flipping the switch seems like it actually means buying back in and committing defensively. Right? It takes energy. It takes effort. And you got to want to play defense. If you look at one point this season, Baylor was number 1 in defensive efficiency. They went into that 21-day layoff 8th in adjusted defensive efficiency. But over this 7-game stretch where they've underachieved, Baylor's been 181st in defensive efficiency. They've struggled closing out on deep shots. They've struggled with their defensive rebounding. Now, those numbers are never going to look great, right, when you play a 2-3 zone. But the eye in the sky doesn't lie here. Like, a lot of this is effort. If Baylor can get back to their hungrier ways, you'd think the tournament wakes them up, right? Baylor's shown an ability to turn opponents over, especially when you have a guy at the top of your defense in Davion Mitchell who's on the ball. I think they can get back defensively, and that's really what's missed. The offense hasn't really skipped a beat. It's just that effort and intensity defensively that hasn't been there since they've gotten back from that 3-week layoff. But I think if they can buy back in, this is going to be a Baylor team that's as good as we saw earlier in the season.
Number 2 seed in the region, the Ohio State Buckeyes. We saw them limp to the conclusion of the regular season, losers of 4 straight, highlighted by a scoreless 4-minute drought against Illinois in the regular season finale. They erased any lingering doubts with a strong run in the conference tournament, coming up just short against the Fighting Illini in overtime, a game where they did trail by as many as 17 points. When you look at what Chris Holtmann has, Dwayne Washington and E.J. Liddell provided as dynamic an inside-outside duo as you're going to find. Slight injury concern for Kyle Young, not quite sure of his availability. What the Buckeyes do well is they shoot free throws as strongly as anybody, led by C.J. Walker, who's 96% from the stripe. But the problem for the Buckeyes, Payne, and you mentioned Baylor not wanting to commit defensively. Well, the Ohio State Buckeyes have been a little bit lax on that side of the court all season long. Will that ultimately be their kryptonite, limiting them in terms of how deep a run they can make?
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State is vulnerable on defense. Their guards don't really disrupt things or lock you down on the perimeter. Ohio State doesn't turn you over. They're not good defending the 3-ball. But the saving grace defensively is somehow Chris Holtmann schematically makes you beat his Buckeyes defense from mid-range. And that's the one thing that they at least have going for them defensively. But yeah, the Buckeyes are a veteran team whose best player is E.J. Liddell, a sophomore. So offensively, this is their calling card. It seems to be a perfect fit of pieces with veterans that play around a skillful young kid that can play with his back to the basket or keep you honest from 3. Metrically, this is the best Ohio State offense since 2011. They can shoot the 3-ball, they make a high rate of mid-range jumpers, and they can score inside. When Ohio State does actually miss, they do a good job crashing the glass. Overall, 119 points per 100 possessions for this Buckeyes offense. They do the little things well, right? They take care of the basketball. They don't turn it over. They attack the basket and get teams in foul trouble. This is a pretty interesting Ohio State team. I know that it feels like they're missing a piece, and I kind of agree when I watch them. But metrically, they're pretty good. Now, let me ask you this. Have you heard anything on Kyle Young's availability? We know he had that concussion where it's kind of scary. They let him continue to play. They weren't sure how serious it was, and they kind of took him out, and it was like, hey, this is pretty serious. Have we heard anything on his availability yet?
Had not as of last night. Hadn't poked around yet this morning as we sit here Thursday in the AM. So curious to see what materializes later in the day or what might ultimately come to light before tip-off tomorrow. So have not seen anything conclusive or concrete about his status and availability.
Okay. I'm kind of poking around right now. Lead us to the next venture as I poke around here.
For sure. When we look at the 3 seed in this region, that would be the Arkansas Razorbacks, a team that finished 13-4 in conference, 22-6 overall, led by Moses Moody, who has been kind of a revelation of sorts for Coach Musselman's bunch. Arkansas, they love to push pace. They can score in bunches, extremely athletic around the rim, and they love to contest shots defensively. One of the issues, much like Alabama that we talked about, Arkansas not exactly the best in the half court, and you do worry a little bit about that. This is a team that lost 4 of 5 in early January to LSU twice, Missouri, Tennessee, and Bama, but all 6 of their losses this season came against NCAA Tournament-bound teams. Last Sweet 16 appearance for the Razorbacks way back in 1996, but they did finish the regular season as hot as anybody before ultimately losing to LSU in the conference tournament. When I look at Arkansas, Payne, a lot of people have talked about them as a team that has the pieces to knock off Baylor and maybe get to the Final Four, but should Arkansas be worried about any opponents on their schedule earlier on that can provide a little bit of wrench in their game plan?
If you look up pace and space, you'll probably see a picture of the Razorbacks. 17th in adjusted pace. They love to push it off misses. 22% of Arkansas shots coming within 10 seconds of a defensive rebound. I mean, they're like up your ass if you don't get back on defense in a timely fashion. But this is kind of what we talked about. Like it's another like ragtag type team that's just long, fast, bouncy, and athletic. Arkansas shoots it well enough. They like to get out. They like to attack the paint and attack the glass. Arkansas is pretty damn good converting second chance opportunities as well into points. But the calling card is their defense. They only surrender 88 points per 100 possessions. They defend the interior pretty well, 36th in close proximity defense. They block almost 14% of shots at the rim. You have Connor Vanover, athletic, 7'3" big man. He's responsible for most of those blocks. He's 15th in the entire country in block percentage himself. I know you're familiar with Eric Musselman, who coached in your backyard at Nevada. He doesn't do anything overly sophisticated, but his guys buy in. They play hard and they attack. Now, the concern would be they haven't really shown well away from home this season, outside the top 300 in away rating. I know it seems like, from the little I've listened to out there, is you're either uber high on Arkansas or you have Colgate giving them all they can handle. I think that I'm probably in the former camp because I think Colgate just can't play that similar style with them. I'm not overly sold on Texas Tech or Utah State. And they're athletic enough to give Ohio State some issues. But I think if they play Baylor, they're not going to out-athlete Baylor. And Baylor's substantially better in the half court. So I know a lot of people are calling, Arkansas as maybe that sleeper team to make the Final Four, which is possible if they're hitting shots. But I'm kind of in between. I'm not the guy calling for the upset versus Colgate, but I'm also probably not the guy that's saying, hey, they're gonna beat Baylor here. So I'm somewhere in between.
That's, a fair assessment. And I think this region in general, in my opinion, I was looking for a team that I had circled. And I'll be honest, I think Baylor, Ohio State, and Arkansas, for me, as far as top three seeds are concerned, all have their vulnerabilities. Ultimately going to have to try and identify somebody to come out of this region. Haven't quite arrived at my decision yet. When you look
maybe it's like
maybe
it's like a Purdue team or something, right? I mean, close proximity to home, maybe a little touch of home court advantage. Now, I think they're young. They're probably... I think we all expected them to be the it team next year. But who knows? Maybe they surprise some people.
Man, that Purdue team is so tough for me to try and figure out. It's a game that has me actually baffled against North Texas early on. I just can't erase the Purdue game against Arkansas Little Rock a few years ago. And when you look at this Boilers team and you wonder where they're going to go for consistent offense on each and every possession. And you talk about a 5 seed in Villanova, a team that I was high on if they were at full strength, but clearly without Colin Gillespie, their ceiling is extremely limited. I don't even know where you begin to look for a true sleeper here. I mean, Texas Tech, coaching-wise, Chris Beard is outstanding, but this team is underwhelmed down the stretch, going just 3-5. Now, to their credit, all 5 of those losses came against teams seeded 4 or better, so maybe it was a byproduct of a very difficult Big 12 road that was there, but Mac McClung and Terrence Shannon have not been those guys. And then, Virginia Tech on the 10-line Payne, are they a team that if they get through Florida can maybe do some things to frustrate Ohio State? Mike Young's been here and done that before as head coach of Wofford.
I was going to kick this back to you because I don't see a team that can make noise outside the top 5 seeds in the South. I think the Sweet 16 is pretty straightforward. Maybe Ohio State slips up if Kyle Young is out and Virginia Tech just cuts them to death. That would be the only thing that could potentially make some sense. But again, I don't see Virginia Tech potentially getting past an Arkansas. But maybe as like this tiny little sleeper, someone that could maybe give Ohio State some issues. Maybe it's Virginia Tech, but that's no easy first-round matchup against Florida. So I don't really see a team potentially causing noise. Again, maybe if Purdue wakes up and figures out some things on offense or takes that next step in their maturation, because I do think they're a year away, maybe they dethrone Baylor. But I just think right now it feels like a lot of the sentiment is a little bit negative towards Baylor with how they've played outside or after returning from that 21-day layoff, that if they just buy back in on defense, to me, they're going to just run away with this region. Although it seems pretty chalky. If they buy back in defensively, no one can touch them in this region.
I will say one thing that's interesting. Should we get Texas Tech against Arkansas? You talked a little bit about the must-bust not necessarily being the best X's and O's guy, but being a big recruiter. You do wonder if Tech can do some things schematically with a 36-hour turnaround to try and frustrate Arkansas because they won't be overwhelmed athletically. And you look at the gauntlet that Tech has had to go through in the Big 12. I actually think it's a massive step up the level of competition they've faced compared to what the SEC is on a nightly basis.
And we know. Right, the coaching prowess. Texas Tech is one of the very best coaches in the land schematically. So on that short turnaround, Texas Tech, if they can survive the Utah State game, which I think even though there's been steam against, we both feel like Texas Tech should be able to beat Utah State in advance. So that'll certainly be an interesting game there if it is Texas Tech and Arkansas, two contrasting styles. So you might be right. I know you're a little bit higher in Texas Tech than I am. So maybe that's the team that surprises people.
We'll find out, and of course, knowing that I'm potentially higher on them, I'll watch a Mountain West team shove it up my ass, and Utah State will pull off the outright upset in the first round. The most intriguing matchup on paper, the 8-9 showdown between North Carolina and Wisconsin. North Carolina, a 1.5-point favorite. Right now at FanDuel Sportsbook in this particular matchup, you look at the total sitting at 137.5. As you begin to dive into North Carolina this year, Payne, just 3-8 straight up against teams that are actually in the field of 68. We know the key cogs in Roy Williams' machine, Caleb Love and RJ Davis, both freshman guards, can be turnover prone. Garrison Brooks and Armando Bacote up front. Offensive rebounding, hey, that's been North Carolina's best offensive set for years with Roy at the helm. But as far as weaknesses are concerned, turnover prone, and they're not efficient shooting the basketball. Can they find ways to score consistently in the half court against a veteran-laden Wisconsin team who underwhelmed down the stretch, but when you dig into the wins and losses, in my opinion, there's no shame in when your losses come against Michigan, Illinois, and Iowa?
Completely agree. Now, on the surface, you're looking at two teams that haven't beaten a soul to get here. Wisconsin's 1-9 against our top 25, 4-10 against our top 50. North Carolina 0-2 against our top 25, 1-6 against our top 50. But it's very clear Wisconsin's played the tougher schedule, as you alluded to. In a coin toss game like this, I think the little things matter. And when you look at turnovers and free throws, Wisconsin's number 2 in the country in turnovers, number 28 in free throws. North Carolina, 257th in turnovers, 295th from the free throw line. Defensively, both teams are top 15 in efficiency, and the area of weakness for Wisconsin has been defending on the perimeter. But UNC hasn't been they don't have a threat from the outside this season. So if you had to pick which team can get into their sets and run better offense, it's Wisconsin. And North Carolina has been pretty ragtag. They want to get out in transition. 36% of their shot attempts come from running out. Where the advantage lies is Wisconsin's 286th in the country preventing transition opportunities. So the focus is going to be about getting your ass back off a miss for Wisconsin. And when you force UNC to play in the half court, it basically becomes a game of volleyball. Throw it at the rim and go get it. North Carolina's freshman guards, as you mentioned there, Caleb Love and RJ Davis, they have been horrific, and that is putting it as nicely as I can. So UNC's offense is basically grabbing misses. They're the most efficient offensive rebounding team in the country. They convert over 10% of their second chance opportunities into points. That's number 2 in the country. But if Wisconsin can get back on defense and limit the offensive rebounds, they will win because they already do the little things well. If they don't get back and rebound, UNC might be able to out-athlete them. Candidly, we made Wisconsin a small favorite. Badgers plus 2.5 and 2 is very sharp. Their entire team feels like they've been in college for about 6 years. So it's like this super
they're
veteran.
all 23 or 24, though, so they actually have been in college for 6 years. A lot of those guys are actually called doctors, though.
Yeah, it was a mission they were on, and I think it was to discover some type of new cheese. But this is like a super veteran team, experienced guards. To me, that matters in the tournament. The interesting trend here, and there's a couple of them, is you mentioned, one being they're not very good at this arena. But again, this is North Carolina. This isn't Purdue. And the other one that's interesting is old boy Roy here, 29-0 in the first round of the tournament. Professional bettors are bucking those trends.
I mean, hey, The last time that we saw North Carolina go down in the opening round back in 1999, were you about 3 years old then, Payne? Harold Deschaux Arsenault, who was the man at Weber State before a guy by the name of Dame Lillard came along. 3-14 showdown, but I think Bill Guthridge was the coach, so it changes a little bit of the dynamic there.
The show. What the heck's his name? What's his last name?
Arsenault.
Got to tell you,
going over there,
when the
you
old
put him in the
Google isn't
machine?
quite pulling him up, we're in trouble. There he is. Interesting.
Well, if you can't spell him the right way, it's going to always be
spelled.
tough to try
It's
to find
spelled
it in
right.
Google.
Wise ass.
Yeah, we'll see about that. All right, one final region to go, and that is the Midwest, where Illinois is the number 1 overall seed. And they are the heavy favorite at plus $1.25. You're looking at Houston, who interestingly enough has taken some money. They opened as high as plus 350 at some shops. I've seen them as low as 2-1 to come out of the region, arguably one of the more fortuitous paths for a 2 seed to have. And then it's a significant drop down till you get to the likes of West Virginia, a very different looking Bob Huggins team. You talk about the 4 seed in Oklahoma State, who a lot of people are talking about as being grossly underseeded, led by Cade Cunningham, and Tennessee, a team that I haven't been able to figure out coming in on the number 5 line. But when you look at Illinois, Payne, their only loss since came against Michigan State since they suffered back-to-back losses in mid-January. This team has really come on strong down the stretch. We knew about Ayo Dosunmu and what he meant controlling the guard position. Kofi in the middle has been an absolute bear, but this team found its stride and found its swagger with a 6-man, he being the form of Andre Curbelo, that's given them an element that they desperately lacked early on in conference play.
Right. I mean, Brad Underwood is a mastermind, and he's finally getting the most out of the talent. And it took some time to put it all together, but you mentioned them being extremely hot down the stretch. Won 14 of 15. Half of those wins were by 10 or more. The only loss was on the road to Sparty. So they have a legitimate shot to win this tournament. But, the Midwest bracket's tough when you think about the possibility of playing your in-state rival from 2.5 hours down the road in Loyola Chicago, who's an easy top 15 team, in the second round. So they didn't get a gift there. Tennessee and Oklahoma State are solid top 25-like teams, and Houston's probably a touch overrated because their conference stinks. But they're a top 10 team overall as well. And if you look metrically at Illinois, there's not a ton of holes there, right? If you want to nitpick, they don't really turn you over, and their defense at the rim isn't anything to write home about. They struggle from the free throw line. Their offense, while efficient, isn't overly sophisticated. They rely on transition. Roughly 32% of their shot attempts come in transition. When they play in the half court, it's basically a spread you out, pick and roll offense or dump it into the post. This is a very good team. I mean, they have a shot to win the tournament. I mean, that's obviously why they're 1 seed. But I mean, they didn't get any gifts there. That second round matchup could be real difficult. Houston's interesting. Oklahoma State obviously has the talent and potential with what we project to be the number 1 overall pick. Maybe that gives them a little bit of trouble. But, if they can get past that second round, they might be pretty free and clear here. So, I mean, I know this is your team from your home state. Anything that might be concerning about Illinois making a run?
I had some questions about some of their secondary scoring options, and they struggled in the half court early on in the season. They were taking a lot of bad shots. They were pushed by teams that I didn't think were quite on the same level as them, but they've shown that resilience. And when you watch Curbelo come off the bench and give them that spark, I think it's provided a different dynamic that Trent Frazier and company hadn't been able to provide. Of course, this team is a lot different if Kofi gets into foul trouble, and you mentioned the potential showdown against Loyola in the round of 32 as Loyola's task gets a little bit easier now that Georgia Tech will be without Moses right up front. Cameron Trotwig is going to be a load, and so if the refs have a quick whistle and Illinois has to go a little bit smaller, I don't like some of their secondary bigs nearly as much, but this is a team that goes as Ayo goes, and you look at a team playing as confidently as anybody. You like to see some of that swagger. They weren't rattled against Ohio State after blowing a 17-point lead, actually even had a chance to cover the opening number when they were up 6 late in overtime. I just like what I've seen from them, and I think when you look at their overall body of work, a very worthy team of not only the number 1 seed, of maybe being that number 2 overall behind just Gonzaga. Now, would I endorse a play on them at 6-1 to win the national championship? Absolutely not. Given the road that they'll have to go through, a moneyline rollover will play a little bit better. And I'm curious to see how they handle the game against Drexel, knowing it's their first tournament appearance since 2013. So We'll get an idea of exactly what the Illini are. You talk about some of the committee metrics, 12 quad 1 wins, the most in Division 1. That, of course, being a byproduct of that daunting Big Ten schedule they play night in, night out.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Payne.
Nope.
No, go jump in there.
Go for it.
I was going to say, no, when you look at the rest of the region, though, Houston is a team that I think is interesting for a variety of reasons. I don't think they're as good as the team that we saw a couple years ago, finish 33-4 and get knocked out in the Sweet 16 against Kentucky. But to Kelvin Sampson's credit, when your leading scorer from last year, Caleb Mills, transfers out and you don't miss a beat, Houston was done a lot of favors. They have, in my opinion, the easiest road to the Elite Eight of any 2 seed that's there. It's a team that's top 20 in offensive and defensive efficiency, and they make you work for absolutely everything. But I think you raised an excellent point. How battle-tested have they really been in an AAC that's down year over year?
I always typically like Houston. I'm forgetting the kid's name. Who was the assassin there who had the man bun for Houston years ago?
I knew you were gonna ask me. It's gonna drive me nuts. So you could talk about this year's Houston iteration. I'm gonna find it now because it's gonna drive me bonkers.
What a good college basketball player. I think his size is ultimately what's limited his professional career. But man, that guy was a walking bucket at the college level. So, I think you hit this perfectly. I think the biggest question anyone probably has about Houston is, are they battle tested? We know the AAC is down. Houston's average opponent rank is outside the top 150. They've played 1 game against a team in our top 25. Now, you mentioned they did overcome some issues this season. They lost Caleb Mills, who decided to transfer him out midseason. Fabian White is recovering slowly from an ACL, and to me, doesn't look himself. But it's hard not to think Houston won't be in the Elite Eight, right? There might not be an easier sector to get to the Elite Eight than what Houston has here. I mean, I guess you could argue like Syracuse. Probably, some people will argue that they don't belong in the dance. And, I mean, about my relationship with West Virginia, and I think they're probably more like a 6 seed. And I probably have reason to be like the most biased human when it comes to West Virginia, but I don't think they're a 3. Illinois will have a more difficult round 2 game than Houston will. So, to me, like, Houston has the easiest 2-15 matchup of the tournament. And we know what Kelvin Sampson's done, right? He's been fantastic at Houston. His teams are tough. They'll beat you up. They attack the glass. Number 2 in offensive rebounding. Sampson has, I think, gobs of perimeter talent. When you look at Grimes, the Kansas transfer, all-conference player of the year. You have Sasser and Mark and Drew, who can all create their own shot as well. It just makes me nervous that they haven't played a soul. But I really don't think there's much in their way to prevent them from getting to the Elite Eight, Todd.
And I think that's part of the reason that we've seen their number come down substantially from where it was at 3-1. A money line rollover wouldn't have even got you there. In a game where, quite honestly, Payne, they project to be about a 2-bucket underdog against Illinois should seeds hold. And I think that might surprise a lot of people. Of course, perception can change as things go on. I was as blown away by anybody that Illinois closed a 6.5-point favorite against Ohio State. So maybe I just haven't caught up in terms of the market adjustments on the Fighting Illini, but clearly something to watch there. When you look at the 3 seed, you mentioned it, West Virginia, a very different looking West Virginia Mountaineers team this year than what we've seen in the past. 3 close losses in their final 4 games. This is a team that wants to go out and outscore you more so than grind you out defensively. Taz Sherman leads a cavalcade of guys, 4 double-digit scorers. Derek Culver, the big man on the inside. It's imperative that he stays out of foul trouble. Problem for West Virginia, they don't shoot the ball well, and they don't control the defensive glass. Not always a recipe for a deep run in March.
Yeah, so listen, I mean, like, there's not many coaches in the country that can do what Bob Huggins has done at West Virginia with that talent level, although he's recruiting a little bit better of late. People have now bought into the system. This version of West Virginia, and you hinted at this, is different. It's basically the inverse of last year's team. They're offense first, defense second. They score about 113 points per 100 possessions, but again, we kind of have them more like a 5 seed than a 3 according to our power ratings. West Virginia's gone 6-9 against our top 50. Now, when the guards are hitting shots, they can beat anybody. But you know me, Todd, like, in the analytically driven world we're in now, like, I don't want 35% of my team's shots 2-point jumpers. And that's basically what West Virginia is offensively. We're taking threes. We want to get something at the rim. We're working in transition. Maybe we're going to the foul line. Like, that's how you're a little bit more analytically sound. Now, West Virginia does shoot it well from 3, but they only shoot it 34% of the time as a team. And with that style, I feel like there's a lot of variance to West Virginia's game. They could get bounced early, or they can make a Final Four run. So that's the interesting part, and you hit on this perfectly. Despite having a guy down low like Derek Culver, West Virginia doesn't rebound on the defensive end that well, outside the top 230 in defensive rebounding. Now they're battle-tested, 15th toughest schedule in the country, the bottom of the Midwest, as we kind of hinted at here. Like, it's not a murderer's row by any stretch, and Huggins is probably the best coach in that sector. I mean, I'm hoping for an Elite 8 Final Four run, and it can happen if West Virginia's shot selection is better and they rebounded a touch better on the defensive side. So let's see, right? Just take better shots, rebound the ball, and you could make a Final Four run here with Bob Huggins. But those things are a little bit of a deterrent for me.
I mean, I know you're rooting for a Brad Underwood, Bob Huggins showdown.
That
I mean,
would be...
you want to see the coaching tree in all of its glory with a right to get to the Final Four.
Yes. Would
so
be fun
when you
to
look
see.
at those teams. Yeah, it'll be interesting because we've talked about West Virginia being underseeded in the last couple of years. This year with arguably, I don't want to say the worst, just a different form, overseeded with where they currently are. When you look at the rest of the region and try and find that dark horse, that Cinderella, a team that can really upset the apple cart, Oklahoma State getting a lot of buzz, Payne, but while Cade Cunningham's a star, I'm not sure I believe in Mike Boynton and his ability to make a ton of adjustments. It's a head coach that's done more that shock me than anything else, and I know he's been bandied about as one of the potential frontrunners maybe for a Minnesota job. Oklahoma State, though, obviously, they need to cherish this postseason run because they may not get one in subsequent years once the NCAA ultimately comes down with a ruling. But if you try and figure out teams outside of those top 4, who do you see check boxes that can make a deep run in this region?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone kind of knows our feelings about Loyola at this point. Georgia Tech, unfortunately, is paired with them, and now they're both stuck against Illinois in round 2. So I don't really have a team outside the 5th seed to make noise in this region. And then obviously we know Georgia Tech got hit with the bug here. It looks like their best player is going to be out. I think the only one that would just make logical sense based upon their number would be San Diego State. But, I mean, they just haven't looked good down the stretch in their wins. They're not battle-tested outside the top 100 in strength of schedule. Just feels like every time we try to make a case for a Mountain West team to make a run, we quickly realize the conference is a massive disappointment. This is a tournament that I would attend annually, and you kind of get hyped up, and then all of a sudden you start to see it's no one defends, and that's why San Diego State seems to do pretty well in the everyone plays off. So it's the guards tend to be a little overrated just based upon the style of defense in that conference. I know Nevada kind of bucked the trend recently, but that Wolfpack team had multiple pros on it. But, the thing that scares me, it's Syracuse zone comes alive during the tournament. And, if you look to San Diego State as a team that could make some noise, I mean, they could legitimately be bounced out in the first round. And I think we'll eventually see some buyback on that 3. That game started to trend towards 3.5, and the market didn't like that. And when you just look at Syracuse and what they've been able to achieve in this tournament and what Boeheim has done, I mean, he exceeds expectation in this tournament. So it makes me a little nervous going with San Diego State as maybe the dark horse to make some noise here. This probably isn't the region that I would be looking for a lot of variance in.
I can't interest you in some Rick Barnes stock along the 5 seed line?
God, that guy. Guy's like a cat with 9 lives. I just... I mean, listen, I think he can, build a program. He can recruit okay. Man, is there just a ceiling on what he can be. I mean, I don't think he's a very good coach. But, hey, who knows? Who knows? I feel like the talent Tennessee has, they've kind of underachieved.
Yeah, I mean, high expectations coming into the year when you have such highly acclaimed guards as Keon Johnson and Jaden Springer. But Tennessee, as we've seen time and time again, can be great one half like they were against Alabama, and you're left scratching your head because they can't put together a complete performance because the offense completely goes kaput. Liberty on the 13 line, Payne. We've seen real money on them against Oklahoma State, or is that more public than anything else, taking that number from 9 to 7.5?
So this is certainly a time of year where the public has their say. And the public might ultimately land on Liberty, but they're doing a majority of their betting closer to game day. Real move, real. Liberty +9, and even they took a second number at 8.5, and that is why you were down to 7 here.
We'll see if Richie McKay and the pack line defense, a Tony Bennett disciple, can frustrate an Oklahoma State team that's as good offensively when they want to be, but still relatively young and inexperienced, led by Cade Cunningham.
I think this is one thing that's somewhat interesting. We're going kind of off the beaten path here, and we'll try to wrap this up inside of 90 minutes. But this is the one time of year where bettors are going to widen their parameters for plays. Right? Typically, this is a lot of just number-driven stuff. But like coaching, style, matchup, all of those things, right? Information, like we see with the Virginia game. Those are things that are going to matter a little bit more in these tournament-style settings. So when you look at Liberty, they really mimic a team like TCU, who's just an absolute snail and has beaten Oklahoma State twice. So that's kind of the correlation and the reason that professional bettors have been on Liberty here, right? Like Oklahoma State out-talents them every single day of the week. But that style we already know has given Oklahoma State trouble. It's the recipe to beating them. And Liberty plays with that same style.
Going to be interesting, as it always is. No matter how much homework you do, how well you know these teams inside and out, there will be some eye-popping upsets, and that's what makes the tournament great, especially when the cream rises to the top and we get some of the best teams in the land playing for the national title, albeit in unique circumstances here in 2021. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You, of course, can follow me there as well. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. For all things NCAA Tournament and March Madness going forward. And as always, FanDuel.com/bettheboard. Go there, sign up, get yourself one of the best accounts in the game. In states where FanDuel is available, they have all sorts of outstanding sign-up bonuses. We all need a great out. Live betting, NCAA Tournament props, you name it, it's all there. Bet the Board is your promo code. Take full advantage, beginning with the Spread the Love campaign with Michigan State. I believe now paying a 94-point underdog against UCLA. I'd expect Tom Izzo to get you to the window at that particular price tag. We do have one last order of business before we close up shop on this opening weekend, and that, of course, is trying to identify where we will be able to make some money. So when it comes to a best bet in the round of 64, Payne, what do you have circled this weekend, my friend?
It's a game that we already broke down, but I think we can make it official. It's not the best number. We obviously would have liked +2 on this game, but I think going with Wisconsin plus the 1.5 makes a lot of sense. Again, they're just the more battle-tested team. I know the record isn't great, but when you look at their losses, it's to all of the elite teams in this tournament. They're the more veteran team. They have the better guards. It's easier to slow a game